All right. So in this second session, I want to talk a little bit about moral pain and then talk a little bit about the process of moral injury and some of the consequences. And then on Thursday, I will talk a little bit more about assessment and some what you could call maybe treatment approaches to moral injury. And I use the word treatment in a very broad sense. First, let me talk a little bit about moral pain. And I want to read this statement to you because I think it is instructive. And this came from an article by someone called Sloan, where he talks about harms, wrongs, and medical moral injury. So here's what he had to say in this article. While the term is moral injury, most of the literature has focused on injury, especially in psychological and social terms, rather than the moral dimension. So they're more focused on injury than morals. This actually is an article from an author in Australia who was talking about moral injury among Australian soldiers. He said it has dealt with etiology, that is, what is the genesis of moral injury, nosology, symptomology, diagnostic tools, and categories, therapeutic regimen, and their efficacy, and more often, and tragically, inefficacy. In other words, he's suggesting that some of the approaches to treating moral injury may not necessarily be very successful. And it also deals with morbidity and mortality associated with the diagnosis of moral injury. And while these emphases are undoubtedly important, it neglects a crucial element in moral injury. And that is,
Check how tight your plug is on the end there. These feel tight.
as tight as I can get it.
Yeah. What if this? What if they complete your skin? Okay, coming back. Yeah, this is crazy. Shake the
So
corner.
I'll finish his statement while he is getting that up. While these things are undoubtedly important, it neglects a crucial element in moral injury. Veterans with moral injury have souls in anguish and not a psychological disorder.
This is brilliant.
So I think what this author is suggesting is that we have tried to treat moral injury as primarily psychological in nature. And we have often neglected the emphasis on moral instead of injury. And so because of that, our emphasis has been on treating injury and ignoring morals, which is actually the very heart of moral injury. So veterans with moral injury have souls in anguish and not a psychological disorder. I think part of the reason why they think about the psychological disorder is because moral injury is so closely, and I think historically related to, or at least confused with, PTSD. And even though they realize that it is different than PTSD, there is still that emphasis to focus on the injury that looks PTSD related than treating the moral part of the injury. I think this is largely what Peter Moran was talking about when he talked about soldiers living in moral pain. Strangely enough, if you were to look at some of the terms that is used in the literature, there's an awful lot of emphasis on moral injury as a problem of conscience. Let me try.
I'm not sure. Cords are plugged in on this end.
Well, you'll just have to take my word for it.
We can do that.
Yeah, okay. So here are some terms that actually show up in the literature on moral injury. And all of them have to deal with conscience. So, and this was an article from an author called Yanko, investigating moral injury, thinking beyond the law conscience binary. Here are some of the terms that turn up in the literature. That moral injury is an abuse of conscience. In moral injury, the individual has a compromising conscience, a troubling of conscience, a crisis of conscience, a lasting insult to one's conscience, the trauma of moral conscience. All of those are terms that turn up in the discussion and the literature on moral injury that suggests that it is not a psychological disorder in the main, but it is primarily a problem of conscience. I wrote a book a few years ago. I'm Free Methodist, and a lot of us Methodists, we look to some of the writings of John Wesley. So several years ago, I don't remember what year, maybe 2013 or so, I wrote a book called Getting It Right, Christian Perfection and Wesley's Purposeful List. Yeah. And I mentioned that book because the literature suggests that moral injury can create wounds of conscience that have a profound impact on human beings, as they can violate the deepest conventions about protecting human life. And I mentioned Wesley because Wesley had quite a bit to say about conscience. Wesley considered conscience, along with understanding, imagination, memory, will, and affections, he considered conscience as a faculty of the soul. It's a faculty of the soul. And he suggested that God gave conscience to every human being so that they might judge between right and wrong. And furthermore, Wesley noted that conscience serves as the perceptive role of deciphering what is right or wrong in his own heart and life, in his temper, his thoughts, his words, and actions. Actually, part of the reason why I use the title Getting It Right, because Wesley emphasized right heart, right thinking, right words, and right action. So conscience serves the perceptive of deciphering what is right or wrong in one's own heart or life, tempers, thoughts, words, and action. In other words, conscience has a kind of an inside-out perspective. It starts on the inside, but it becomes reflected in right words and right actions. Internally, it involves having the right heart and right thinking. And conscience therefore possesses the ability to judge both the rightness of the interior as well as the exterior life. So moral injury really is a problem of conscience that begins on the inside, but it has some implications for what we do in our outward life based on our knowledge of what is right or wrong. It brings me back to the topic of moral pain, which occurs when a person is involved in or witnesses events that violate their morals, values, or ethical code. And in such situations or emotions, even though it is a matter of conscience, our emotions are deeply wounded. And if pain is not expressed, worked through, or healed, it can result in long-term behavioral, psychological, or spiritual suffering. Now, of course, I think that the emphasis should be on morals so that there's a heightened spiritual emphasis, but it goes hand in hand with psychological and behavioral kinds of implications. So in Living in Moral Pain, Peter Moran suggested that the unacknowledged source of much of the veteran's pain and anger, profound moral distress, arising from the realization of having committed acts with real and terrible consequences. And furthermore, he suggests the inadequacy of the prevailing cultural wisdom or models of human nature and or modes of therapy to explain moral pain or provide ways of dealing with it. In other words, he's suggesting that we really don't know what to do with moral pain. Maybe we know how to treat physical pain, and maybe we know a little bit about how to treat psychological pain. We don't know very well how to deal with moral pain. So Moran suggested that society has few useful ways to approach moral pain or guilt. Perhaps that has to do with the fact that a lot of times, at least in our current society, people of the cloth are kind of set aside as not having too much to add to the treatment of individuals. Or maybe it is that sometimes those of us who are ministers, who are chaplains, we largely work out of a psychological model. And we do not bring our spiritual and theological understandings to situations. Many years ago, I read a book by Paul Prusser. And I should tell you that Paul Prusser is a psychologist. The book was called The Minister as Diagnostician. And one of the things that he suggested, having worked in a hospital with psychologists and chaplains, which I did many years ago when I was doing one of my internships, not one, I was doing my internship, and part of my rotations during that year of psychological internship was in an inpatient psychological hospital. And Peter Moran did the same thing, not Peter Moran, Paul Prusser. And he suggested that many of the chaplains ignored their theological bases and tried to argue and present arguments from a psychological perspective.
All the time.
And so he suggested that, in a sense, they lost their identity when they lost their theological grounding.
Right.
Yeah. Very common.
Oh, yeah.
As though we believe that our theological basis is inefficient, inadequate to answer some of the deep problems of life. So we resort to psychological explanations rather than theological explanations. So society has few useful ways to approach moral pain or guilt. That is our realm. And in fact, Prusser went on to say that ministers are by nature theologians who have the right and the responsibility to bring a theological perspective to every problem that they encounter, and not simply resort to psychological explanations in treating human problems. Now, being both, I'm borrowing the title, that I'm theologian, small t, not big T, theologian. I do have an MDiv. But also a psychologist. I am very much aware of that. And I know that I can work out of both hats. But too often, people of the cloth resort to psychological explanations for problems that are deeply theological. So from his perspective, from Peter Moran's perspective, moral pain remains for us a form of neurosis or a pathological symptom, something to escape from rather than to learn from. I want to suggest to you today that all of you that are here as chaplains, you're theologians. And you ought to be able to bring that theological perspective to situations that you encounter. And even though I believe that psychological perspectives are valuable, they're not any more valid than our theological perspective. And so we need to bring our theological perspective to the table. When I worked in that hospital, we would have staffings. And so you would have medical doctors, and you have nurses, and you have a psychologist, and you have the chaplain all at the table. We don't need the chaplain to be a psychologist, because he's not going to be a very good one. Okay. We need the chaplain to be a theologian and bring a theological perspective to what is happening as we think about clients at the table. But that's enough of that ranting and raving. Peter Moran suggested that it's considered a disease, moral injury that is, rather than an appropriate, if painful response to the past. And so he suggested that in Vet's literature, one frequently notices the ways in which various phrases and terms are used to empty the vet's experience of moral content. In other words, to ignore the moral content at all and just focus on the psychological content. So why do we ignore or avoid the idea of moral pain? Several things. The limit of the discipline itself. He said it's the most significant thing, that we don't have a good idea of moral pain. He also suggested that there is an inadequacy of psychological categories and language in describing the nature and pain of human conscience. And that much of the confusion related to therapy and moral pain stems from the therapeutic tradition itself. A therapeutic tradition that relies almost totally on psychological models and doesn't have a place for spiritual kind of themes. I think to some degree that is changing in the broadest sense. If you were to go to the average psychological convention or counseling convention, you might hear people talking about spirituality. In fact, I read a book several years ago, I don't remember the name of the author, but he talked about spirituality as the fifth force in counseling. The first major influence came from the psychodynamic tradition of Freud. A second tradition is the emphasis on behaviorism. A third one is the influence of Carl Rogers. A fourth one is the emphasis on multiculturalism in counseling professions. And the fifth one, he says, is spirituality. That spirituality is the one that is now driving the counseling field, the therapeutic field. But if you were to go to a counseling convention, you might hear them talking about spirituality in the broadest sense. You wouldn't hear a whole lot of Christian spirituality. Okay. That's the only one that is largely avoided. You know? But they will talk about spirituality. So the therapeutic tradition has largely ignored, up to this point, an emphasis on spirituality. And even though there's now that emphasis, it largely excludes Christian spirituality. I wish we could get this working again, because I would like you to see the next chart. It's a nice slide that has to do with, I'm gonna switch it, I'll put it in another port. See if that makes a difference.
So like, yeah.
Let's try it again, because I really like, if possible at all, for you to see. Yes, there we go, okay.
I heard Chris muttering threats a moment ago.
Okay. I wanted to share this chart with you because I thought it was very informative. What is the process that leads to moral injury? Notice it begins with an event. Part of the confusion with PTSD is because PTSD also begins with an event. But in moral injury, there are life and death choices that have to be made. If the events might involve acts of violence or witnessing violence, and or not protecting individuals in the face of violence. There are morally compromising positions. Witnessing others, especially leaders, violate moral codes and dehumanizing others. So maybe in those events, you can hear the two approaches to moral injury. There's a bit there of betrayal, but there's also perpetration or witnessing these kind of acts. And those events transgress the individual's moral code. And then you have, at least according to these individuals, moral injury. Moral injury religious. They're here talking about some of the ways in which these transgression of our moral code injures us religiously. So they then talk about religious struggles, loss of faith, questioning foundational beliefs. But notice they're trying to also pull up the psychological piece, at least they think it is psychological primarily. I don't necessarily believe that. Moral injury, psychological. And notice that they put under here terms like guilt and shame, moral concerns, feelings betrayed, loss of trust, difficulty forgiven, loss of meaning and purpose, and self-condemnation. And I thought to myself when I saw that, well, nearly all of those terms under psychological have moral implications, religious and spiritual implications. So why separate them like that? Maybe we can say that these things that they call psychological, they may have some psychological ramifications, but largely they are core elements of spirituality.
Who wrote the chart?
Huh?
Who wrote the chart? Cody?
I found it, no, that is not mine, it's not me, but I found it online and I thought it was.
Who wrote the chart? That's why. they
Okay,
decided
okay.
to the source.
So what are some of the potential outcomes? And notice that here, they're talking primarily, not so much about spiritual outcomes, but, much of that language has to do with psychological problems. PTSD, depression, anxiety, relationship problems, pain, physical disability. So even when they talk about potential outcomes, they don't talk about outcomes in terms of spiritual. It is mostly psychological. And again, I think that underlines what Peter Moran said, that we don't have good models that deal with spirituality. But I would say that many of the things here you see are spiritual. What are some causes? Two things: commission, acts of commission. When someone does something that goes against their beliefs, and acts of omission. When individuals fail to do something in line with their beliefs. Individuals may also experience betrayal from leadership, others in position of power or peers that can result in adverse outcomes. So what are some of the consequences? They can affect our self-image, how one views and expresses their individuality and worthiness. And then three consequences that arise out of that. It can cast ambiguity on moral perception and reasoning. It destroys confidence in viewing and interpreting self, others, and God. And it undermines one's moral compass and judgments in terms of the past, the present, and the future. I want to say a little bit here about moral injury in clergy sexual misconduct, because that is so pertinent to us. That when these actions occur, they lead to diminished agency, which leads to feeling of numbness, despondency, and pervasive sense of futility. And in those situations, most of this has to do with both pieces of moral injury, betrayal, and perpetration. It damages relationships, leading to individuals feeling safe and trusting others, and undermines the credibility of the church. About 2 weeks ago, one of my friends at Asbury Seminary, a professor, spoke in chapel about integrity. And you would have thought that maybe ministers would be high in terms of how they're perceived by the public as people of integrity. They weren't. The top of the list was nurses. I think maybe something like 50-something%. Ministers were way down the list, something like 15%. In terms of being viewed as persons of integrity. So we as well can create and perpetrate moral injurious events.
Yeah.
Want to share another chart with you that maybe shows you again how these things are blurred. This particular article talked about the consequences of moral injury in several different areas. In fact, I found one study. In fact, it was a review of 59 studies that found the following: that individuals with moral injury reported symptoms across 7 categories. This was 59 studies that this author looked at and said, what are some of the categories that people are talking about? Here they are, very much like this list: emotional, cognitive, behavioral, social, spiritual, psychological, physical. This was a Turkish study, actually, from symptoms of moral injury. A review of 59 studies found the emphasis on emotion, cognitive, behavioral, spiritual, psychological, and physical. Very much like what you see here, that there's an emotional response, there's a relational response, there's certain thoughts about self, there's a behavioral response, and there's thoughts about life. But look a little further under each of these. Shame and guilt, they classify those as emotional responses. Loss of honor. It seems to me that when we get to dealing with shame and guilt, we are talking in the moral realm.
Yeah.
But look under relational. Loss of trust, contamination, unforgiveness. Sounds spiritual to me. Thoughts about self. I am not good. I cannot be trusted. I'm a failure. I'm hopeless. I'm not good and I cannot be trusted. So very much spiritual to me. Behavioral response. Inability, unpredictability, inability to calm down, impulsivity, emotional outbursts, and unresponsiveness. And then thoughts about life. There is no God. There is no goodness. Life has no meaning. Life has no purpose. God is not good. So even though they classify these, of course, according to these 5 different realms, we can look at many of these realms and we still see that undergirding of the spiritual reality. So I suggest that there's a critical importance of dealing with spirituality when you're addressing moral injury. It's critical. And because of that, I think you as chaplains have a critical role to play in addressing moral injury. So I'm going to first of all talk about the spiritual, the existential, the loss of faith and meaning and a sense of purpose. I'll talk about that first. And that's where I will talk a little bit about shame and guilt. And then I'll say a little bit about psychological feelings of guilt, shame, anxiety, and depression, and maybe a little bit about behavioral, the self-isolation, the self-harm, substance abuse, and relationship difficulties. So what is the impact then of moral injury? I think at the core, it can lead individuals to question their faith, their spirituality, perpetuating a cycle of mistrust and doubt. There's a loss of faith in oneself, in others, and the literature talks about a higher power, but we know in that is the Christian God. There may be struggles with one's faith or spirituality. There are feelings of worthlessness and something that I think our brother down here talked about earlier, difficulty forgiving oneself. There was an article that I encountered that talked about these different areas that one should consider. It was an article called Spiritual Wounds and Injuries. It talked first about spirituality and science. And what they were talking about here is that PTSD, which has been confused to some degree with moral injury, is in a sense scientific in nature, but it doesn't explain spirituality, or it doesn't deal with spirituality. But we know that if we're going to address moral injury, it involves some kind of relationship with God, with the divine. And therefore, we can utilize spiritual tools, spiritual resources in grappling with moral injury. And the author furthermore suggested that sometimes in the literature, spirituality is an afterthought. It doesn't get primary attention. In fact, the author suggested that in much of the moral injury literature, research tends to be seen about spirituality as either an aftermath issue where an individual's loss of faith is a symptom of the overall moral injury. So it doesn't see spirituality as a central issue, but more of a peripheral kind of issue. But finally, this author argued that spiritual damage is an important aspect of moral injury, and that we have to pay attention to that area of their lives. We have to focus on spirituality. I mentioned this book earlier. This is a book by Michael Lewis, who I said I didn't know that he was a Christian. But in talking about shame, he used that picture, a famous picture. I don't remember the author of that picture now, but it's the expulsion from Eden. And in that book, actually, I think Michael Lewis is a social psychologist. He talks about the nature of shame, and that shame has to do with being exposed, being seen as naked. And because we do not like to be seen as naked, we have to find some way to cover up ourselves. Thus, fig leaves. Okay? So what is shame? Shame is always an attempt to cover something that we do not want to see about ourselves. So always, shame is a covering. It's a covering to shield ourselves from being exposed and be found wanting. Shame is when the belief about the event generalizes to the whole self, where the person is now focused on themselves. I am bad because of what I did. But I don't want anyone to see that, so I'm going to cover it up. I wrote a book a few years ago, I think I mentioned it earlier, called Created for Responsibility, where I use the example of David when he committed the sin with Bathsheba, and every behavior that you see after that is cover-up behavior. Okay? Everything is being done to cover up. So he has Uriah. Okay, I'm going to have him go down and meet with his wife so that we can say the child is Uriah's. And when that doesn't work, he sends him to the front line, get him killed. All to cover up, so no one sees what he's done. Here's the thing. As long as you're covering, there is no forgiveness. If you're hiding, there's no forgiveness. So what occurs in David's life that makes a difference? It is God's intervention. It is the intervention of Nathan. And he tells that story that suckers David in. And David's righteous indignation comes to the fore that man deserves to die, not knowing the man is him. And then Nathan said, "You are the man." If you read that narrative again, that up to this point, David never said, "I have sinned."
Right.
Because he was busy covering up. Okay. You see, when you are covering up, there's no confession. And without confession, there is no forgiveness. When Nathan said, "You are the man," for the first time in that whole dirty episode, David says, "I have sinned. I have sinned." No longer is he covering up. In fact, what he's doing now is uncovering. That has great implication for moral injury, and we've already suggested that David's perpetration fits pretty well with either the perpetration model or the betrayal model. I have sinned. No longer am I covering up. I am uncovering. Actually, that's a big difference between shame and guilt. A lot of times people confuse the two and think that shame is equivalent to guilt. They're not, they're different. Shame covers up. Guilt, legitimate guilt, because some people, they have neurotic guilt that is no guilt at all. But real guilt always uncovers. As long as you're covering up, there's no possibility of forgiveness. It is only in the uncovering that one can expose and say, "I have sinned." I think that has a large message for how to deal with moral injury. It has to be uncovered. It has to be exposed to the light of day, not with everybody, but with a confidential listener who can hear your story and, in a sense, give absolution. I have sinned. It is then that admission, I have sinned, where I'm no longer trying to shamefully cover myself, but when I'm willing to admit I've done something wrong, that one can experience healing. You see, as long as David was covering up, there was no forgiveness. But after he said, "I have sinned," we have the evidence of Psalm 32 and Psalm 51, where he lets it all out. So guilt involves an uncovering. And actually, sometimes people talk about guilt as unhealthy. Real guilt is always a healthy response to wrongdoing. And if you talk to the average therapist, they'll give you the impression that guilt is unhealthy. If you were to read the social psychologists, they will tell you guilt is very healthy if you've done something wrong. I have sinned. And what happens there is that God is the one who did the intervention through Nathan. And I would say in that passage when Nathan said, "You're the man," God moves David from covering up to finally uncovering so he could be healed. I think that's one of the things that we need to do with people who are experiencing moral injury. who are covering up. They don't want anyone to know what they've done. What they really need to do is to be able to uncover. Here's what I've done. I need forgiveness. Not simply dealing with a medical mental health diagnosis, but dealing with the spiritual wound that has been uncovered. I'm going to go past, let me quickly mention some of these things, because I think these things are also related to moral injury. These are some of the psychological dynamics that it can affect, or regulation, altered emotional regulation, altered consciousness. We sometimes see that in PTSD. Altered self-perception, including a sense of helplessness, shame, guilt, and self-blame. I think when you see shame and guilt side by side, it's when people confuse the two of them. They're not the same. And I think that that is a clue to making a difference. Altered perception, altered relationship with others, searching for a rescuer. Maybe chaplains can be the rescuer that helps the person who is suffering from moral injury to move from covering up to uncovering. I'm gonna. I think if we are going to be able to assess this well, we have to understand that moral injury and PTSD, even though they are related, they're not the same. There may be some overlap, but they're not the same. As I finish this section and leave maybe about 10 minutes for question and answering, I ran across this particular approach to moral injury. It helps patients identify and evaluate beliefs such as hindsight bias. Hindsight bias has to do with a tendency to see an event as more predictable than it actually was. So the person looks back and said, I should have seen this. I knew it. But they're looking at it in hindsight. It's not real. And they suggested that it affects how we remember and judge past events, often leading to overconfidence in our ability to predict future outcomes. So the person looked back and said, I should have known that. No, you shouldn't have known that. You couldn't have known that. So help patients identify and evaluate beliefs such as hindsight bias and responsibility that contribute to shame or guilt. I don't like the guilt and shame because it tends to conflate the two. I didn't help them identify important values, including those that were violated during the trauma, and make a plan to live in line with those values. I think the major thing that I shared in this second session is that we have to help people to uncover. Because a person who has engaged in one way or another, whether through betrayal or whether through perpetration or omission, they want to cover that up through shame. What really will further their healing is be able to uncover that event with an admission of guilt before a chaplain or some other person who can hear their confession and offer, in a sense, absolution, forgiveness. I wonder if, after David said, I have sinned, I wonder what Nathan did to help him with that confession. I wonder if on that day, Nathan became not only the prophet to point David to his sin, but after the confession of his wrongdoing, he was there to hear his confession and offer him, in a sense, absolution. I think that is the role of the chaplain, to create space where people who have engaged in moral injurious events have the opportunity to uncover what they have hidden for so long in the presence of a compassionate, empathic listener who can offer them a path to forgiveness and to God. And I think that is where chaplains come in. Thank you. We've got about 8 minutes. If you have comments or questions, all of them don't have to be questions, okay? Yeah, several.
I'm wondering, you talked about how we default to psychological terms
Yes.
and abandon the theology stuff. I wonder if that may be due to the fact that the popular image of Christianity and the way Christianity is practiced a lot is focusing on God as a punishing God, eternal punishment.
Mm.
Who would admit that
Perhaps.
that's what they were facing?
Perhaps. I think that one of my colleagues at Asbury Seminary, I remember I was in a Sunday school class with him. And he described God as a God of holy love. Okay? And you have to have that image. It's not holy that leads to only wrath, but it's also love, holy love. And that is the image of God that we have to present to the world, a God of holy love. So you're not diminishing one for the other. He's holy, and he doesn't like unholy actions, but he's also love. And you have to hold the two of those together. We tend to separate those things, you know. Holy over here, love over here, really they have to be brought together. A God of holy love. Yeah, here and there here.
Well, simple question. A person can use simple logic to show that the atheistic viewpoint is self-destruct. It's a matter of seconds. However, when you went, well, there's also of MI, or as you pointed out here, and started off me, people still have saying anyway, they'll run to atheism if there is no God, because that's what had happened to them. So, are you in agreement that that's a reason why most atheists exist today, for that reason? Due to the moral injury they experience?
Are you asking me that?
Yeah.
Because I don't know that I know the answer. You might know the answer better than I do. What do you think?
I believe it is.
Okay.
Horrible experience in church as a child. I remember these were clergy, or just verbal abuse from clergy, or a child, something went way wrong in a church experience. And that struck the person's life for the rest of their life. Said, that's it, I'm done with Christianity, or anything to do with God, period.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm teaching a class now online. I told you that I still teach a class or two at Asbury if it's online or intensive. I don't like the idea of going there every week to teach a class. So I'm teaching a class online right now. And I just was reading the response of one of the students to a question that I posed, and they described something like that they had all these negative experiences. This person actually grew up in a Pentecostal environment where there's so much emphasis on that. They just said, threw it all away. But now they've returned, you see. And this person said, because of those negative experiences that I had, where I was ostracized and stuff like that, I always want to debate anything that I hear that sounds similar. But now they're trying to debate that because they have encountered God for themselves and not simply in the images and some of the things that they experience. Whether that was their own perception or not, I don't know, but it did have an impact on them, but that person was able to return. I don't know if that answers your question, but
That's
yeah.
thankful. I think you
you got to, I was frustrated, but you finally got to the language.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry to frustrate you.
The language of sin and the language of naming the demon.
Mhm.
And why is that? The word that you, I think, left out might have been the demon of denial.
Okay.
And why are we so caught up in denial? You know, shame, but also shame is connected with ego.
Mhm.
We're so focused on our image.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we're unwilling, it's hard to do what David did, hard to
Yeah.
uncover,
You know,
and let go of ego.
and yeah, I'm glad you said that. In that book that I mentioned, Getting It Right, I recall Wesley saying that there is a kind of a trilogy that people who struggle spiritually have. He said the trilogy, which is very much like what you find in Satan. Pride, self-will, anger. It's a kind of a dangerous trilogy that he says infects a lot of people. Pride, and that might have something to do with why I'm hiding it. Pride, self-will, I'm going to do it my way. And then this expression of anger. He said that's a royal trilogy that a lot of people grapple with. Pride, self-will, anger. Yes, sir.
I guess I take away from what you're saying that spiritual harm is a deep injury to a person's core belief and values. And how spirituality is important that
Mhm.
can shy away for that for the psychological.
Mhm.
But I think one of the struggles that a number of chaplains may have is that the people that we work with, whether it's at the facility or churches, or people we may come in contact with, there's a difference. There's some people who believe in Christian spirituality,
Mhm.
you know, with rituals and scripture and all that sort of thing. And then there are some who just believe in spirituality, quest for meaning
Yeah.
and purpose.
Mhm.
And so I think sometimes get into that rut in distinguishing between the two and able to address those issues. It's easier to go to the psychological.
Mhm. Okay, okay. You know, what you just said actually raises another important point to me. I don't know that we can take everyone who has experienced moral injury to the place of healing. Because not every one of them might want healing as you know it to be in uncovering and forgiveness. And so I think that it's largely, we have to adapt our approach to the person with whom we are dealing. There are some persons that really want to uncover, but there may be some who don't. And you have to be very careful that you don't try to impose a cure where the person doesn't want the remedy.
I wonder, the emphasis on the psychological rather than spiritual, is it maybe a form of embarrassment on our part?
Embarrassment, maybe. I think it's because we think that psychological methods, physical methods are much more sophisticated than our own method.
Yeah, I've taken CP from two different branches, and the APCE and to the Catholic unit. Oh man, the Roman Catholic unit was incredible, and I thought it was refreshing. It was very spiritual. Where the other one was a lot of navel gazing.
You know, I developed a course at Asbury Seminary several years ago. I last taught it about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a course called Pastoral Diagnosis. And one of the things that I try to help students to understand is that a lot of different practices do diagnosis. my mechanic does diagnosis, okay? You know, let me hear that engine, what's that sound like? It's diagnosis. And they have these little physical tools now, they pull out that thing and they push in the instrument and it tells them what's going wrong. They're doing diagnosis. Psychologists do diagnosis. Medical doctors do diagnosis. And I should tell you that it's not a 100% accurate science. If it was, they wouldn't say, try this medication, let's see if it works, okay? It's not, but we think of it as much more sophisticated than our diagnosis. But we also have the ability to do spiritual diagnosis. It may not be as sophisticated as, let's say, a medical doctor, but it is still trying to figure out what is going wrong and what needs to be done to correct it. But we tend to think of our approaches as inferior to the others. And that is partly the reason I think that we say, okay, let me use this instead of this. Okay? But we're theologians first. Well, that looks like it for today. Oh,
That's very quick. You just brought up that hit a sensitive nerve,
okay.
because so facilities I've been in, corrections, seems like the chaplains are treated as the least important.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
sure.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
It can be quite discouraging
Yes.
to go behind the bars every day and face that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed.
You know, that may be a product of at least two things. One is their evaluation, but it's also maybe partly our evaluation. So if I'm going to change that perception, I have to come with theological insights that contribute greatly to the case management. You know, so, and not hide it. If we're hiding it or we're not trying to speak out of that theological lens, maybe they think we don't have anything to offer. So I don't know. So it may be a product of both sides. But anyway, thank you for listening. I hope some of this was useful. And then on Thursday, when I speak again, I'll talk a little bit more about how do we actually get into some of these nitty-gritty things. And I'll share a couple of programs that I know that are out there. And I'll talk about things like transgression relief, which is the primary thing that we're doing in moral injury. Thank you for your time and your attention.
We have a break, at this point. We'll gather back in this room at 5:30 for dinner. All right, and then at 7 o'clock, we will do a Zoom meeting with Rachel Hillier out in Portland, Oregon, to talk about